Armsmaster's Summons by James Solomon. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Chapter 1. Unlawful Seizure. It's interesting such a trait has never before been noted. While the interface is notoriously lacking in its willingness to explain, perhaps some tests could be arranged. Asa Ward nodded in understanding as his customer, a thin mid-20s man with sandy hair, wearing a turtleneck and jeans, continued complaining. It's bearable when just shooting light shot, but even then it hurts. Looking at the general, unimpressive build of his client, Asa wondered if sweeping strained him, much less a shotgun recoil. "May I see it?" he asked with a gesture. With a slight grunt, his client reached down and lifted an old leather-soft case up to thunk on the counter. Barely pausing in his narrative, he gestured for Asa to take a look and continued on his tale of his pappy's, God rest him, favorite old gun. Tuning out the client, Asa ran a hand over the old case. The leather was still supple and well cared for, with none of the common cracks or dust of a grandpa's favorite old gun. He was used to people coming in with such things that were old Sears and Roebuck specials from the 1920s. He was sufficiently tired of, "It's sentimental," or "I don't care about the money," all the way up until the bill came due. He had long since started asking half of the cost up front. That way, even in the rare event that someone persisted in asking for the old thing to be cleaned, or repaired, or re-blued, or whatever, when he invariably added it to his closet rack of fixed, unpaid-for, priceless Grandpa's guns, he'd have at least something. Unzipping the case to reveal the fluffy wool interior, enveloping a nice old Browning A5, he raised his eyebrows in surprise. While not super rare, someone bringing one in wasn't overly common. Noticing the safety was off, he interjected, "Is it loaded?" into his customer's stream of consciousness speech. "Huh? Oh yeah, gotta keep it ready for the bad guys, huh?" His client, who Asa then decided to call Bubba number 2041, said with a conspiratorial grin, "I just don't understand why my pappy liked it so much. He was dang near 90 and went shooting every weekend. If it kicked that hard, it would have broken something." Asa quickly unloaded the weapon and locked the chamber open. Examining it a bit closer, he saw it was slightly better than typical of its type. The scrollwork decoration was unscratched, and the screws looked in fairly good shape. The old shotgun was clearly well used and showed its wear proudly in the high spots. It was well coated in oil, and no rust appeared anywhere on the old girl. Pausing for a moment, he looked even closer. The gun was a bit too well oiled, and he nodded to himself. "You clean it?" he asked Bubba number 2041. "Huh? Oh yeah." Number 2041 puffed out his chest in pride. "Never been much of a gun guy, but there's not much you can't find on YouTube. Wasn't as hard as I thought at first. Nothing a few Q-tips and some WD-40 couldn't fix." Asa sighed and nodded. "You want to be careful with YouTube. There's a lot of good stuff on it, but sometimes things can be missed." Standing the shotgun up on the counter, he pulled the barrel towards the rear slightly and unscrewed the barrel nut. Slipping the barrel off, he laid it in the case and slid off the fore end, revealing a large spring capped by a brass friction ring. The tube had obviously been oiled, and the friction ring was set for the lightest loads. Nodding again in confirmation, he nestled the gun alongside the barrel in the case. "I see your problem," he said, addressing Bubba number whatever, who was still waiting for praise on his obviously expert cleaning job. He grabbed a business card and flipped it over. Writing Browning A5 on the back, he slid it over to his client. "These old guns have a few tricky bits that modern ones don't. It takes a bit to keep them running right." Trying to be somewhat diplomatic and not simply saying he'd messed up with oiling the friction tube, he smiled. "Should just be $75 for a standard cleaning. I'll check out the rest of it a bit more in-depth and make sure it's all okay." Tapping the card, he said, "If you go to my website on the front and search for this, you'll find how to clean it in the future and how to set up the friction ring. It has to be changed a bit depending on what type of rounds you're shooting. It should be ready for pickup in 2 days or so. Finishing up the paperwork didn't take too long. After getting his client on the way, Asa flipped over the sign beside the entrance and locked the door. He always got snarky at the end of a long day, but he shouldn't take it out on his clients, even if they did use WD-40 on their guns. Too much of that, and he'd be one of those grumpy old men. Sitting back down at his desk, he tapped his earbuds and lost himself for the next hour in the latest Star Wars audiobook, and the pleasant smoothness of the parts of the rifle he was assembling. When his alarm pinged that it was time to go home, he was surprised. "Good book?" he muttered, pausing the audiobook and getting up. He stretched slightly and walked over to lock the door, realizing he already had made him chuckle. "Getting senile early, it seems," he muttered to himself while he gathered his things. Shrugging on his coat so it fell neatly over the pistol at his waist, he frowned as spots appeared in his vision, and he was struck by a wave of dizziness. Stumbling slightly, he thunked backwards into a stool and shook his head. Stood up too fast? He frowned. He'd been planning to head home to play his latest Star Wars game, but maybe he should hit the gym first. His wife and kids were out of town for a few days visiting the family, so it wasn't like he didn't have time. I know I'm not 20 anymore, but I refuse to hit 40 and see stars when I stand up. He stood back up, intent on getting in at least a small workout before his game. He made it all of 3 steps when the stars reappeared in his vision, and another wave of disorientation washed over him. He stumbled and stopped in a clear area. Then his workshop rippled around him. He slowly rubbed his eyes, his brain snapping into action despite the disorientation. He was ignorant of many things he knew, but the world did not typically ripple like a disturbed pond. Lowering his hand, he frowned as the stars in his vision multiplied. Going from a dull white, they flared into myriads of colors, getting brighter and brighter, obscuring the world around him. Another wave of dizziness shook him until he felt his mind seized somehow. The uncanny feeling of a massive grip around his psyche filled him with primal fear at the sheer vicious intent. A feeling pounded through him, not truly words, but a feeling so strong it needed no translation. "Weapons?" Against his will, his mind started serving up all his memories of countless rifles, pistols, and shotguns he'd worked on over the years. Trying to rein in his memories, his mind resisted, under something else's control. "Powerful weapons," the presence insisted. His mind switched to visions of grenades, bombs, and other things he had studied, like some creature was dragging its fingers through his memory. His will beat futilely against whatever force gripped his mind. He cried out in pain and frustration as the stars in his vision multiplied more and more, becoming a glowing rainbow blizzard he could barely see through. The feeling lessened somewhat, as if it were running out of power, but another interrogative slammed into his mind. "Make weapons?" He could feel the fingers in his mind starting to pull up memories against his will when finally his anger ignited. The impossibly smooth wall separating his mind from his will seemed to develop a roughness to its metaphorical texture. His anger forced his will to grip harder somehow, in a way he'd forever be unable to explain. He forced the wall back. He could feel somehow that the power was almost spent, and he fought harder against it. Trying to formulate an answer to this horrifying power that his mind was his own, he gritted his teeth and staggered, gasping for breath. He realized sweat was coursing off him in rivulets. "Enough." The feeling slammed again, somehow feeling less than before, and his mind was released. The stars around him were whirling so fast it seemed it had become a shimmering curtain. He tentatively reached out to touch it. The tip of his finger burned as he touched the curtain, and he jerked his finger back. Unfortunately, his finger remained in contact. His attempt to jerk back pulled him off balance. In a desperate attempt to stop his fall into a wall of rainbow fire, he took one staggering step, and just like in one of his glitchy indie developers' games, he fell through the world. Asa flailed wildly for his workbench, floor, and even the foundation of the building as he fell through it all at impossible speeds. Staring at his workshop like he could see through walls, at least certain ones, was an odd experience. Surreal. He knew he should panic, but his brain just couldn't seem to grasp the situation. Maybe he was dreaming? He knew this most certainly did not happen in real life. The rapidly receding view of what had been his workshop faded into blackness, a void so pure as to make nightmares look over their shoulders nervously. Even though he never moved his eyes from the spot his workshop receded to, he was now lost. He was still falling, though he had no clue how he knew that. Even if he could figure out how to move in this void, he knew there was no way he could find his way back. It was all darkness, so pure it seemed to mock the very idea of light. If video games are anything to go by, he thought, I'll just pop back up into existence 1,000 feet above my shop, and then fall to splatter on the roof. At that moment, he seemed okay with that. At least he would die somewhere. The thought of dying in this endless void sent shivers through his consciousness. Time stretched out. There was no wind, no light, nothing to mark the passage of time by. He could have fallen for minutes, hours, and at times it even felt like years. He'd tried to move his hands, to move something to provide a reference point, but couldn't seem to locate his hands. Did he even still have a body? He wasn't sure. He could no longer feel his body, assuming it still existed, and for a time it sent his mind into a spiral of anxiety, building on itself more and more. But just as he was losing hope, his mind truly beginning to unravel into madness in this alien environment, if only for self-preservation, he was distracted. A point of light appeared infinitely far off. He was barely able to recognize it as different, but as soon as he had, it began to rapidly swell in his sight. It grew closer, or possibly larger, at a speed that he somehow knew was fast, but had no way to compare to anything else. Rapidly it gained details. Fuzzy around the edges, the light was yellow-tinged and wavering. Eventually, he began to hear things through it. A mumbled rhythmic sound or some kind of song or chant. After struggling with it for a short eternity, his mind finally placed a label on the anomaly, familiar only from his video games. A portal. As he sped towards the portal, on a collision course that seemed imminent, he would have probably chosen to enter it, given a choice. Any place was better than this nothing. As willing as he may have been at this point, however, no one seemed to be paying particular attention to his whims at the time. He slammed into the ring of light without seeming to slow at all, while the portal itself only provided a minor discomfort as he passed through it. A combination of all his nerves reawakening at once and maintaining his rate of speed conspired against him. Chapter 2. The Grace of Righteousness.
I, of course, would be most in favor of any tests you may wish, if only we had parameters for them. Where would we even start?
Righteousness contemplated her power reserves, while basking in the feeling of raw magic released by the sacrifices from her many temples. She always enjoyed the influx of power during her high holy days. Her priests seemed to have outdone themselves this year. The altercation in the south with corruption had prompted them to make sure she remembered who served her. Not that she would forget, of course. She was righteousness. Forgetting her mortal servants would be unseemly. By and large, she was pleased with the state of the world. Her siblings had been mostly behaving, and while the internal squabbling continued, the past few centuries had allowed them to at least pretend civility in their dealings. The city councils really were a brilliant move. Allowing all the gods to continue to manage their own issues within an area, while not openly wiping away their rivals' minions, had resulted in a boom to the mortal population that pleased righteousness. While the true balance had remained unchanged, the influx of sheer power was quite pleasant, and she thought all her siblings were so accustomed to it that she doubted any would be willing to deprive themselves just to spite another. Suddenly, shockingly, she felt a draw on her core. It wasn't a massive amount, but the mere fact that it had started without her willing it so was a shock. Immediately, she cycled her mana, and her power flared. Her main temple, where her presence was focused, burst alight with radiance in a pulse of her glory. Waves of awe spreading through the assembled worshippers. That, however, was beneath her notice, as the draw on her core impossibly maintained itself. Thin though the draw was, it was many times what a mere mortal would be able to wield without frying themselves to a cinder. Righteousness focused her will to end the flow of power, but it remained entirely unresponsive to her will. The alien feeling of her own power ignoring her will sent a small shiver of apprehension through her. Seizing the thread in a mental grip, born of ages-long practice, she allowed it to pull her along with it. Almost instantly, she was at her destination. Absorbing the scene, she found herself in an old temple of hers. Very old, actually. Clearly, one that had only been upheld in structure by the power of consecration, and even that had allowed decay and pests to encroach. Tisking to herself in irritation at the poor condition of one of her temples, she swept her presence through the abandoned halls. Following the lone thread of power underground, she discovered a large group of her priests. At least they wore her livery, and their auras bore her mark. But there was something off, wrong. Her not recognizing them was no surprise. She could hardly be expected to know all mortals that crawled into her priesthood, goddess or no. But there was an ineffable difference to these, something that was almost right, but not. The draw of power she had followed led to a large ritual being performed by the 40-some priests. It centered on a large glowing circle sketched in the middle of the cavernous chamber. Glancing at the ritual, she frowned. While she eschewed ritual magic, having no need of such clumsy mana control herself, she was still familiar with it, doling out the occasional worship or blessing ritual to her priests. This one, however, she didn't recognize. Not only was it not one of hers, but the schematic drawn on the floor followed none of the rules she knew. To make things worse, she realized, it was the ritual itself that was somehow using her power, the priests only being able to empower the first circles of the ritual. Just as she was becoming alarmed, a portal sprang into being in the center of the floor. After only a few moments, someone rocketed out of it. The stranger slammed straight into the leader of the circle, an older man with a frail build. The two went tumbling against the wall of the chamber. Predictably, the elder priest was not able to maintain control over the ritual or the circle itself. In an abrupt, gut-wrenching moment, the flow of magic supplying the ritual, both from the priests and the goddess's own core, cut off like a knife. Instantly, the ritual twisted. The lines on the floor glowed angrily, their power being unable to complete their function. Of the gathered priests, only a few paid enough attention to even realize that something was wrong. Most rituals, once they had accomplished whatever they were designed to do, had an ending portion that safely disposed of all the power infused into the ritual. In this case, not only was that amount significant, but the design of the spell required ongoing control to safely dissipate that power. Recognizing that the spell was about to backlash on its casters, Righteousness cast a shield over all those gathered, including whatever it was they had summoned. While she didn't know what was going on, she fully intended to find out. Not only had these people summoned something in her name, they had dared use her own power to do it. She would discover not just what was going on, but how they had managed to use her own power without her consent or foreknowledge, and put a stop to it. Asa didn't know who or what he had just slammed into. He was, however, thankful they had been there. Hitting another body had slowed him down enough that he didn't kill himself smacking into the wall at high speed. Of course, at the moment he was mostly concerned with screaming. His entire body was on fire with the worst case of pins and needles he had ever dreamed possible. Made worse, he was fairly certain, by something breaking when he slammed into his somewhat bony greeter. His panicked flailing probably didn't help matters much either. Rolling over on the floor, he gazed around and realized that he was not the only one yelling. There were probably almost 40 people dressed in old-school robes that were scrambling towards him. Uncertain if they meant him harm or, well, really, he was pretty much uncertain about everything. His hindbrain seemed to be busy trying to figure out if he should continue screaming. His eyes fixed on the odd glow surrounding the portal he had come from. When he had first seen it in the strange void on the other side, it was mostly a yellow, bluish glow that seemed almost welcoming. Now it had shifted to a red, purple color that seemed to promise violence and retribution. The world seemed to almost indent around it, a strange darkness shading it. For a moment it held still, and a few of the priests glanced back at it, eyes widening in alarm, just before it exploded in violet flames. A wave of power blasted out and enveloped him, held back millimeters from his skin by a scintillating crystal shell. At this point, his brain came down firmly on the side of hallucination and decided to send him for a hard reboot. Without further ado, he passed out. As the ritual backlashed, Righteousness grimaced in irritation. She had placed the shield to protect everyone, but it seemed her priests had linked themselves to the ritual by blood. The fools. When the spell struck out, it did so with the typical explosion, and with a slightly more unusual search along the lines that had powered it. Completely bypassing her shield, and effectively overloading her priests' cores. The more powerful of them simply died, the weaker exploded. That left only the stranger protected by her shield, and she was not optimistic about gaining answers from him, especially since he was out cold. In a stroke of luck, however, the ritual itself had been drawn well enough to be able to read its remnants. As the explosion faded, only the summoned man remained alive. He looked to be a tall, well-built man in his 30s with brown hair, which was unusual for this region, enclosed in a very fine but simple gray jacket, green shirt, and blue pants. She frowned, taking in his garments. Uncertain though she was where he had been summoned from, it was clearly not local to this world. All the cloth was unfamiliar to her, and she did not think it could have been made in this world. Shifting his body with her power to lay on his left side so hopefully he wouldn't choke himself if he vomited, she swept her senses through the unconscious man, and nodded to herself. Other than elevated chemicals in his brain, 3 minor fractures, and assorted bruises, the man appeared to be in good shape. Allowing her power to seep into the man, she healed his fractures and washed away the bruising. She slightly modified some of the brain chemistry to lower what was obviously a stress reaction. She did not want to do much more than that, however, as brain chemistry was always a touchy business. Deciding to allow him to wake naturally, she expanded her focus past the temple estate and through the area around it. It was in the northeast, in Power's primary area. There was a smaller temple of hers in the nearby city with a decently sized contingent of her priests. Examining them and their auras, she found nothing odd about them. Everything was precisely as it should be, and there was no off feeling. Disturbed, she focused back on the ritual. Where had it come from? Who had researched it? And most importantly, how had it drawn on her power? There was also the matter of the man. Who was he? Why had he been summoned? Asa woke slowly, his brain muddling toward wakefulness in his usual slow progression. Relaxed and without pain, he went to stretch when he suddenly realized that the surface he was laying on was cold and hard. Opening his eyes, he glanced around to find a charnel house. Gasping in shock, he immediately regretted. He retched at the awful smell of copper. His brain slowly came up with the details of the events leading up to now, and he blanched even further. The strange events of earlier had an oddly dreamlike quality. He would have been only too glad to realize it was all a strange dream, brought on by breathing too much hops number 9. He groaned and looked around the chamber he found himself in. It was mostly of white stone, reminiscent of marble, though it had some dark patterning around it. Wood beams gave support to the domed ceiling. All considered, it would have probably looked very nice, if not for the bodies littered across the space. Pools of blood ran from many of them, and some of them looked as if pieces had flown out from where they stood, littering the areas around them in unpleasant shades of drying blood and viscera. The longer he looked, the more awful the scene became, the smell of voided bowels also making itself known through the cloying scent of blood. Frantic, he looked around for an exit. He had no clue where he was, but would happily jump into Dante's 9th layer of hell to escape this room. Spotting an archway across the room, he lurched to his feet and tried to make his way towards it in a confused, halting run. Taking 3 times as long as he normally would, he stepped around all the splashes he could to try and keep his boots mostly free of the various unfortunate fluids seeping across the floor. Just as he finally made it to the archway, he froze as a powerful, feminine voice rang out.
"Who are you?"
Asa spun, staggering slightly as his eyes scanned back over the bloody chamber. Could he have been wrong? Was someone still alive? Did they need help? "Who's there?" he called out, voice strained.
"The goddess,"
the voice replied smoothly. Asa stared, making sure that no one was moving. Nothing in the room stirred.
"Do the gods not speak in your realm?"
The voice continued after a moment. Asa spun on his heel, stepping through the archway. "Nope, not doing it. Not having a conversation with a voice in my head in a room full of dead people. I know I'm hallucinating, but I'm not that far gone." Looking around the small antechamber, Asa discovered a small staircase heading up, and a few old-style arch-top wooden doors. At this point, he just wanted out. Starting briskly up the stairs, he paused as a young woman shimmered into view.
"I am not a voice in your head,"
the young woman stated peevishly.
"Nor am I a hallucination."
Her voice was melodic yet full of power.
"Hallucinations clearly don't pop into view out of nowhere."
She appeared young, maybe 19 or 20, small almost to the point of tiny, but proportioned flawlessly. Beautiful, certainly, but somehow cold. "Yeah, actually, that's exactly what hallucinations do," Asa muttered, staring suspiciously up at the woman. The woman huffed, putting her hands on her hips.
"Most mortals aren't so flippant when addressing me,"
she said in a warning tone. Glancing around the staircase, then behind him, Asa frowned. He wasn't far enough away from the creepy room. He started back up the stairs. This whole thing has to be a dream anyway, he muttered to himself as he went to brush past the small woman. Her eyes grew round in shock, and anger washed across her face at his dismissal. Flexing her power, Asa yelped in surprise as he abruptly fell up the stairs. Slamming into a stone wall on a small landing, he groaned. An inescapable weight pressed him into the wall, off the floor.
"I speak to some in dreams,"
the woman said in anger.
"But few are foolish enough to dismiss me if I choose to bless them so. Now, who are you?"
Asa's eyes were wide. He could feel every grain of texture of the wall he was being pressed into, and he clearly recalled the pain when he had come through the portal, his mind spinning angrily at all the strange events. He locked eyes with the small woman apparently holding him against the wall. He immediately felt the weight increase on his chest, and got a clear feeling that this pretty young woman could crush him out of existence with a mere thought. "Okay," he gasped out. "I'm prepared to admit you may be real." The pressure remained on him, the woman's eyes as icy as ever.
"May be real?"
she repeated in a dangerous tone. "Assuming this whole place is," Asa choked. 5 minutes ago I was at my shop about to head home." Frowning, righteousness allowed him to drop to the floor.
"It was closer to 3 hours ago."
She cocked her head and examined him briefly.
"Your shop. You're a shopkeeper. Not many shopkeepers could afford clothing that fine."
She narrowed her eyes and allowed her mana to inspect the clothing.
"Is that knitting?"
"Knitting?" Asa asked, confused. Glancing down at his t-shirt, he raised his eyebrows in realization. Yeah, it's a t-shirt. Look, ma'am, I'm not trying to be rude, but who are you? What is this place? Where is this place, for that matter?" Thinking back, he added, goddess. Who were those people back there? How did I get here? Gods don't speak on my world, no." He was talking faster and faster, words spilling out as more a reaction than anything else. "My world? This is a different world? How do I get back?" Righteousness recognized the signs of shock and held up her hands in a comforting gesture.
"Calm yourself, mortal. You are under my protection here. I am the goddess of righteousness. We are in an abandoned old temple of mine. You were summoned from somewhere by a group of my priests. Where from or why, I don't know. I was hoping you could tell me. Now I ask again, who are you?"
Asa opened his mouth to answer, then snapped it shut. He thought for a short moment. Goddess of righteousness, huh? Look, I've read stories where, He looked at the woman, noting the fact she was clearly growing irritated, and finally asked, "Do names have any particular magical powers here?" Righteousness raised her eyebrows.
"Names have magical power? An interesting idea," she mused. "Other than in specifying an identity or perception, no. But that's hardly magical. Do names bring power in your world?"
Asa shook his head. The idea of the stories of the Fae had popped into his mind, and he had wondered if giving his name would somehow enslave him to this woman's power. But then the freight train that had been on his chest didn't seem to need his name, so, "I'm Asa. I run a gunsmithing shop," he finally answered, only giving his first name just to be safe. The self-proclaimed goddess nodded.
"Asa, well met. Smiths we have in plenty, though gun is something I'm unfamiliar with. Why were you summoned?"
Asa shrugged, confused. "You're the goddess, you—" He paused at the last comment, cutting off the "tell me" he'd been about to say. Remembering just how easily she had been angered, he changed it to, would doubtless know more than me."
"Don't be a fool,"
the small woman huffed.
"What did the prompt say?"
Asa blinked blankly. "Prompt?" Nodding with an exaggerated movement, she answered in a slow, exaggerated voice, as if speaking to someone of exceptionally slow wit.
"Yes, the prompt you accepted during the summoning?"
Asa glared at the woman's dismissiveness. Goddess or no, the imperial rudeness was not helping matters. He'd been through an entire gamut of emotions in the last few hours, and his pig-iron stubbornness was just itching to get its turn. The snark isn't helping, lady, he said flatly. What are you talking about, prompt? Righteousness was silent for a long time, inspecting him.
In your interface, she said at last. All summons require an acceptance prompt in your interface before taking action.
Asa blinked again. Interface? He said hesitantly. The woman's eyes grew wide.
You don't have an interface? What are your traits?
Asa sighed. Look, can we at least get further away from the smelly room back there? I'm exhausted and would prefer to not have an interrogation on the stairs near the bloody room of horrors that apparently sucked me away from my family. The woman's eyes widened a bit, then narrowed.
Very well. At the top of the stairs, 5 meters to your left, there is a room with a bench. My priests from the city have already been summoned. They will be here shortly. They are to help you understand what happened to you. You will answer their questions as best you can, else my protections will be withdrawn. You seek a way home. My support is the most likely way to find one.
Asa opened his mouth to respond, again caring very little for veiled threats and imperious demands, when the woman vanished without a trace. The golden, steady light that had illuminated the stairways vanished too, leaving a faint, guttering yellow of a torch apparently at the top of the stairs. Huh, Asa muttered. That's a neat trick. Deciding to test the vision's words, he trudged up the stairs. Finding himself in a dusty but decently lit hallway, he looked to his left to, sure enough, find a small alcove about 5 paces away. In it was a stone bench, dusty but shaped so it at least looked comfortable. Wiping the thick dust to one side, he sat with relief, determined to work through what was going on. If the theoretical priests didn't show up in a half hour or so, he'd just have to go looking.